Oh my gosh, thank you so much for the intro. Sorry, I'm getting my screen set up. But that book buffet was awesome. All the presenters were amazing. Lots of books that I have also not got to. So, but thanks so much for joining me today. And I'm just thrilled to be here at the WIDS conference focusing on responsible machine learning. My name is Kelsey, like Shana said. I will be doing a presentation on cissexism or transphobia in automated systems, which is very much an under-discussed aspect of like an already very under-discussed field of responsible machine learning. A quick introduction. I know I just kind of got one, but a longer one. I'm a data scientist in industry. I've worked in public health research, software development, and government consulting. I'm also the founder of Data Science, which is a site that's devoted to highlighting the LGBTQ+ experience using data science and analytics. So we've been around for a few years now. We have a growing team of data folks, developers, traditional researchers, and designers who are all just really, really passionate about the intersection of data and LGBTQ+ issues. So we've published a variety of data journalism type pieces, from super fun pop culture type things to more serious discrimination and injustice focused pieces. So please check us out online or on the socials if you're interested in that kind of thing. But the main thing I want to talk about today is gender, and how gender is very complex. It's this deeply personal, individual thing that is completely non-apparent, non-obvious, and honestly just extremely confusing. It can be confusing for someone to understand their own gender, the gender of others, sort of the concept of gender as a social construct in general. So whether recognized or not, gender is just truly this beautiful and complex, like undefinable thing. Unfortunately, we live in a society that has taught us that gender and sex is binary. It's kind of the opposite of complex. And these days we even see it being taken a step further with automated gender classification. So the idea that a computer, or more accurately, like a largely homogeneous group of computer programmers, would be accurate in determining somebody else's gender. When the reality is, gender is hard for humans to understand. So the idea that a computer can do it is, completely unrealistic, absurd, and in a lot of ways dangerous. I'm a data person. I'm aware that all the data that we use is a simplification of reality in some way. But as more information and understanding is available, and sort of the younger generations are more aware and vocal about gender beyond the binary, our systems just need to evolve. These rigid male and female boxes just aren't working for people anymore. Some people are going to move from one box to the other. Some people are going to be in both. Some don't fit in either. Some are in the middle. Some are going to move around. So there's just so much more to gender than our society has taught us to recognize, and we can do just so much better than binary data systems. So today's talk is about why we should and how we can do better to capture the complexity of gender in our data systems and be more inclusive. And I think these pictures do a great job of illustrating this. They're from an extremely talented queer abstract artist that I encourage you to check out if you're on the gram. But we will have a 4-part presentation today. We'll start with a quick Gender 101, which will maybe be a review for some folks, but I just want to make sure that everybody is sort of on the same page with the terminology and the things I'll be using today. Followed by some examples of cissexism in machine learning or automated data systems, and kind of what this looks like in real life. And then we will talk about some of the current research in this intersection, which will not be comprehensive by any means, but I definitely want to highlight sort of the main players in this space, and hopefully show you some interesting things to check out if you're not already tracking. And then I'll end with some actionable things that we can all do to do better in this space. And as part of that, if we have time at the end during the Q&A, I would love to share like a very early draft of a tool that I've been kind of brainstorming and thinking about that would hopefully help with an aspect of doing better in this field. But that's the overall plan for today. And with that, we will jump right in. So like I said before, gender is complex, right? But the easiest way that I've found to conceptualize gender is to use my friend, the gender unicorn. And the gender unicorn breaks down and illustrates different dimensions of identity, showing that, gender identity, or sort of your internal sense of being a man or a woman or something else, is very different from your gender expression, or how you perform gender or present yourself to the world through your clothes or your hair, your voice, your body, your mannerisms, all that sort of things, which is also completely separate from your sex assigned at birth, which is typically what a doctor classified you as after looking at your genitals or your chromosomes. The gender unicorn also includes dimensions for sexual and romantic orientations, just kind of illustrating that those are separate from gender and can be different. And there are many different combinations of all these different dimensions. So today, when I say the term cisgender, I am talking about people who identify as the same gender as they were assigned at birth. So for example, if when you were born, a doctor looked at you and decided you were female, and after growing up and having a sense of your gender, you are indeed a woman, you would be typically considered cisgender. Even though, these two dimensions dictate that you would be classified in like a cisgender category, your gender expression could be anything. You might be hyper feminine and present more stereotypically in feminine clothes or hair, or you might present more masculine and be considered what, a society might call you something like a tomboy. Or maybe you present as like a mix of these things, masculinity and femininity, or something else all together. There's just endless options in this gender expression dimension, even though you're still considered cisgender as your gender identity. Similarly, there are endless combinations of sort of your sexual and romantic orientations. So, these could be all sorts of different combinations. So for this particular gender unicorn, they might describe themselves as like a cisgender lesbian with a very interesting gender expression. So you can use your imagination there. Transgender, on the other hand, just means the opposite of cisgender. So a gender that is different than the sex you were assigned at birth. So again, if you were born and a doctor looked at you and decided that you were female, but then after growing up, having a sense of your gender, you are actually a man or a boy, you would be considered transgender. In this example, you would typically be described as a transgender man. Alternately, if you were born and a doctor decided you were male, and after growing up and getting a sense of your gender, you are actually a woman, you would typically be described as a transgender woman. Cisgender and transgender are adjectives. They just describe your gender identity. So people get mad when you say like cisgendered or transgendered with an ED, because it sounds like something was kind of done to you or something happened to you instead of just like something that describes you, no big deal. Just like before, with transgender folks, your gender expression can be anything. Even if you identify as a transgender woman, like this particular unicorn, you might be more comfortable presenting more stereotypically masculine. As part of this expression category, some transgender folks pursue like a physical or a medical transition, some don't. It doesn't make anyone more or less transgender just because gender expression is this completely different dimension. Also under the transgender label are a number of identities that are considered like non-binary or outside of being a man or a woman. These might look like experiencing gender as a mix of masculinity or femininity, or even not having a gender at all. And it still falls under this trans umbrella because you identify as something other than what you were assigned to at birth, which is typically binary, although technically it's still not that simple for sex assigned at birth, right? Because intersex people exist. You might have heard the statistic that intersex traits are about as common as having red hair in our society. So sex assigned at birth is definitely not binary. Unfortunately, genital reassignment surgery is a thing for newborns who can't consent, but it's like an awful thing that shouldn't be happening. Just to show just how many combinations of identity there are, I wanted to share a thing that I've done at Pride a couple of times, and it's Pride Month, so this is extra relevant. I I've walked around with like a giant board of identity labels and some markers, and I go around, talk to people, and make a collective data visualization of people's SOGIs. And SOGI stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So it's a little bit simplified than what we saw from the gender unicorn, but you know, you're carrying it around. But you know, you can just see from this data visualization how beautifully diverse this stuff is. You know, there's so many different combinations of how people can identify on these different dimensions. And even expanded labels, you know, I try to fit as many as you can on there in these categories, but it's still just never enough. You know, people were putting lines in between categories, they were adding categories. It's just, you know, people and identity is so complex. It's just really a beautiful thing. As a quick positionality statement, I do identify as transgender, or sort of under this transgender umbrella. I'm gender fluid, which is one of those non-binary labels that we talked about, which for me just means that my gender fluctuates or moves around over time. And if you're interested, I wrote a pretty lengthy data-driven, like personal narrative about this on data science a few years ago. So when I say that gender is complicated, like I'm very much speaking from experience. Like I get the confusion and the complexity. I spent the majority of my life confused about my own gender, and then committed like 3 solid years of rigorous data collection on myself just to try to figure this out. So with that being said, you know, while I am part of the community for my personal identity, I'm definitely on the very privileged end, given my race, education, citizenship, and just so much more. Even being transmasculine affords me a good amount of privilege as well. You know, being assigned female at birth, but presenting or dressing more masculine is much more socially acceptable in our society than the other way around, largely because our society devalues femininity. So given this, I try to be very mindful of the space I take up within the transgender community. And I'm very deliberate about when and how I talk about my experience. Which very much brings us to the topic of cissexism. It would be really, really cool if gender could just be part of your identity, like no big deal. But we live in a world that also has very strong power dimensions. And transgender folks definitely get the short end of that stick. So when I talk about cissexism or transphobia, I'm referring to the discrimination against transgender people. And this actually has roots in colonization. The gender binary developed as a way for colonizers to separate themselves from indigenous peoples that had a more expansive understanding of gender. And if you're interested in this, I encourage you to follow Alok on Instagram as well. They're a gender nonconforming artist and influencer who has a lot of like educational posts. And if you liked Book Buffet, you'd really like them. They have a lot of like book report type posts, which are really cool. So cissexism or transphobia has many, many forms in the world. You might be most familiar with the recent explosion of anti-trans state legislation in the US that has been aiming to limit youth sport participation and access to medical care. So 2021 broke all sorts of records. This data is back from April, and it was also already surpassing like so many like terrible records. A lot of these bills ended up dying, didn't have enough support, but a handful went through. I know at least 6 states, very extreme laws went through that are really troubling for trans youth and their families. There's also been ongoing debates about transgender access to healthcare, military service, employment, bathrooms, identification documents, like things that are pretty important for basic existence in our society. In addition, there's tremendous violence waged against the transgender community globally, but in particular, transgender women of color. In the US, transphobia is similarly very intersectional. Black trans women are by far the most subjected to discrimination and violence. And this is due to a mix of racism, misogyny, and transphobia. So in short, you know, a lot of societal hostility, very few legal protections, if any, making this a pretty dangerous situation. Which brings us to how cissexism finds itself into machine learning and artificial intelligence, or just sort of data systems in general. Cissexism in automated systems takes many, many forms, from more microaggressive, like having limited gender options when you're taking a survey or you're signing up for a service, like here on Facebook, to more serious and sometimes even explicitly harmful and targeted systems. And like I said before, the lack of legal protections and societal hostility against the community really makes this intersection, or sort of the subset of responsible machine learning, unique, because you see that these technologies not only get away with it, some are even like openly transphobic, which you don't see as much with other like protected oppressions, right? Except for the exception of maybe like classism, because the point of a lot of algorithms is like to discriminate based on wealth. But in this section, I will share a few examples of what these systems look like in the wild. And we'll start with the most well-known, or the most discussed, which are TSA airport body scanners. So I'll ask you all to kind of think back to the last time you were in an airport. Might have been a while for some of us, but let's think back to what the security screening process is like. So you're waiting in a huge long line, you finally get up to the front, you put your carry-on bag on the x-ray belt, and then you wait in like that smaller line to get into that huge millimeter wave body scanner, which is the big machine that kind of circles you. And there's an agent on the other side of that machine that waves you in, and while you're walking in, they're looking you up and down and deciding in that moment if they're going to pick a pink or a blue button on their screen, which will decide what kind of body the algorithm is going to compare you to. Now, we just kind of learned about the complexity of gender and gender expression and sort of the non-binary nature of even sex assigned at birth. So hopefully you see some issues with this right away. A cisgender person who has a gender conforming expression will have zero issues getting through. They probably won't even think about it because this is a binary system that was very much built for them. But for many trans, gender nonconforming, and or intersex folks who might not have the exact combination of genitals or physical characteristics within that binary normal that the algorithm is expecting, this process is extremely, extremely scary. And as you go through the process, if a transgender or gender nonconforming and or an intersex person ends up throwing an alarm based on this algorithm, they're essentially outed right away. And what happens next is very much dependent on how accepting and respectful like the individual agent on duty is. There's been complaints about this for almost a decade since this technology came out. And there has been increased training in recent years, but just sort of given how rampant transphobia is in our society, the best you can kind of hope for is just like to be humiliated. At worst, you're going to be harassed, detained, subjected to very invasive screenings, etc. And experiences here, again, vary very widely in an intersectional way. There's like one sizable survey of transgender folks in the US. It's from back in 2015. And we know from like that one survey that transgender, gender nonconforming, and or intersex folks who are multiracial or of Middle Eastern descent are the most likely to have a negative airport security incident. But almost any trans person that you talk to has a TSA horror story. Some folks will avoid flying altogether. Some will detransition or try to present in a more gender conforming way to some extent if they have to fly. But for many folks who have pursued maybe hormone replacement therapy or some sort of gender affirming surgery, this is no longer an option for them, right? Not that it was ever really a solution in the first place. But in that case, kind of like what these pictures show, no matter which button, which of these binary options the agent decides to push for them, they're going to throw an alarm, purely for just having a body that falls outside of these cisgender norms. Facial recognition technology, or FRT, is another example of cissexism in an automated system. And I think this crowd is probably pretty aware that facial recognition technologies have many, many issues. But the fact that a lot of these services also offer like an automated gender recognition, or AGR, is especially problematic for folks who don't resemble the particular binary gender expression stereotypes that these models are trained on. And I have some examples in the wild of how facial recognition technology has been deployed in a very cis-sexist way, starting with Uber. Uber rolled out a system called real-time ID check, where periodically drivers, as they're working, will be asked to verify their identity on the fly. Which kind of makes sense in theory. You know, the company wants to make sure that the person that they've cleared to drive based on their driving record is the one that's actually driving around passengers. So in theory, it was a good idea. However, they use a facial recognition service that compares people's photos to what they have on file. So a one-to-one sort of comparison thing, which has been proven to be an issue for transgender drivers who are going through a physical transition and have a changing appearance over time. And some of this is on the company for not handling, you know, administrative things very well. There's been a lot of complaints on a number of different topics, but the technology here, I think, also plays a part. You know, instead of coming up with a more inclusive verification process, they chose to go with, you know, an automated text system that we know has flaws. You know, we know that facial recognition technology works better on lighter skin tones. We know that it's reliant on a consistent appearance over time. So this quote from one of their transgender drivers about how marginalized people fall through the cracks of overly automated systems is just spot on. You know, in this Uber example, we're talking about people losing their livelihoods for the sole reason just being they can't get through an automated system that was built for cisgender folks. Another classic or sort of infamous example is Giggle. Giggle is a social networking app that was built for females, which is the word that they use, not so much mine. And to keep it safe, they use a facial gender verification technology that they're very proud of. This picture here is from their website homepage where they say, Giggle, where you are protected by gender verification technology. And what's fun about Giggle is that they have been like blatantly transphobic in the past, to the point where the founder, not even a year ago, asked on Twitter that if a trans woman is somehow able to get through their like very sophisticated gender verification process, they decide not to join out of respect for this like female only space. And they got called out pretty hard by the community, and they tried to change their stance a little bit. I went down like a rabbit hole of their way back history on their site, and it was very entertaining. So at one point, they were like, okay, trans girls are welcome on Giggle, but you'll have to go through a manual verification process. And then they go and use in like a number of like dog whistly type terms, like real girls. This manual verification process will be monitored by real girls, implying that trans women are not real women. And you know, both male and female genders, implying that gender is binary and related to your sex assigned at birth. Just things that kind of make it clear that if you're trans, you're not really welcome. What I also found ironic is that they say that their facial recognition technology is like a legit bioscience and not a pseudoscience like phrenology, which I found extremely ironic because that's exactly what some opponents of facial recognition technology are arguing. They're saying that facial recognition technology is the next iteration of phrenology because it's being used in a similarly racist and sexist way. But anyway, now it's almost a year later. Giggle doesn't mention trans people on their site at all anymore. They just kind of describe in detail what their algorithm is doing. So very much, I think one of the book buffet talks kind of talked about this, where they're taking the blame it all in the tech approach, like our hands are clean. But if you look at the founder's Twitter, like she's very much doubled down on her original stance. She's what the community would consider a TERF, which unfortunately we've already learned about because we encountered one during book buffet. But it stands for trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is centered on this belief that including trans women will somehow disadvantage cis women, which is, you know, just completely baseless and really just an unfortunate divide. But to wrap up facial recognition technology, you know, the biggest concern I think within the community is that with the current political climate and sort of the lack of acceptance for trans folks and the lack of protections legally, that these existing cis sexist technologies can be easily weaponized against transgender folks. So in this case, we'd be going beyond just sort of individual developers being unaware or apathetic to these issues, but being legally and intentionally discriminatory. And there's already reports of like AI startups marketing technology that would, you know, keep female dormitories safe from like predatory men in dresses. And just with the nonstop debates about transgender access to basic institutions like bathrooms and healthcare, is like, this is a very real possibility for the future, for our current reality. In addition to these algorithms that kind of look at physical characteristics, we also see cis sexism creep into things like NLP models, natural language processing. Many of you might recognize this example that have to do with word embeddings. When they were first becoming a thing, like this example was everywhere. You couldn't read more than an article or two without seeing it. And, you know, mathematically, it's very smart. You know, the model can do word math. It knows that a king minus man plus woman is approximately equal to queen. And, you know, vector representations, you know, it's very clever mathematically, but there's no denying that a decision was made here to represent gender as binary, reflecting sort of the cis sexist world that we have and that we all live in. And the thing that always gets me is like, they're so proud of it. Like, this is the example for word to vec. And to me, it's like the NLP equivalent of how gender is used in every like stats 101 class is like the binary variable example, when there's like so many other actual binary variables that you could use, but we always go to gender for some reason. But NLP is used a lot in like hate speech detection and content moderation, which also has a way of like easily becoming discriminatory. Google Jigsaw has a service called Perspective for moderating comments for toxicity. And immediately, this was released about 4 or 5 years ago. And immediately after they released it, they got called out for having a number of like identity words being read as toxic by their algorithm. So, you know, Jigsaw responded pretty quickly. They wrote a Medium article where they talked about how these words are unfortunately used in a lot of derogatory contexts, which contributes to the scoring, and how they're working to de-bias their model and all that. But, you know, I ran this example like not too long ago, and it was still scoring pretty high, like not in the 80s anymore, but we're almost in the 70, we're almost scoring in the 70% likely to be toxic. So you think they would fix like the one example that they kept getting called out for, especially when I guess now they are marketing this product to like benefit marginalized people. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, this is just an example of how cis sexism is baked into a lot of NLP type things, which has, you know, search and marketing consequences. You know, for example, exclude lists will often have a lot of queer and trans words in them because like fetishes are a thing. Any training data that you have that was labeled by like Mechanical Turk type services will have baked in bias, stuff like that. It's very, very hard to escape. So hopefully that gave you a sense of what cis sexism in automated systems kind of looks like in real life. I now want to quickly go through, I have time. I now want to go through some of the current research that's happening in this area. And you know, this is exciting for me because responsible machine learning isn't a huge field to begin with, and sort of cis sexism is an even narrower focus, but there's some really, really talented folks doing really cool things, and I want to put them on your radar if you don't already know them, starting with Oztease. So Oztease is probably the most outspoken researcher in this field. If you read like any mainstream media report on these issues, kind of the one I had screenshotted earlier, it seems like they're always the ones that's being interviewed, and they do a really good job about talking about these issues. They're currently a PhD student at the University of Washington in human-centered design and engineering, and a couple of years ago they wrote this blog post called Counting the Countless, which was very, very hard-hitting. It talked about many of the issues that we've discussed today, you know, about how automated systems are a threat to those that kind of fall out of that cis-het norm or cisgender heterosexual norm. And, you know, in general, Oz is definitely not in the reformist camp at all. Like, they are very much an advocate for a radical data science that works for everyone, which is not what we have now. Academically, their biggest contribution so far was this paper that was more of a lit review that looked at how gender was discussed in a number of studies that had an automatic gender recognition component, or an AGR. And not surprisingly, they found that the majority of the papers in this space had a binary understanding of gender. They presented gender as unchanging and very much rooted in physical characteristics, which, as we've discussed earlier, you know, is not at all accurate or reflective of reality, and very trans exclusionary. Morgan Klaus Schwabman is another major player in this space. He's a PhD student at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he's also with Microsoft's ethical AI group. And the coolest thing that he's done is this evaluation of gender classification in commercial facial recognition technologies. So this is probably the coolest thing I'll show you this whole presentation. It's basically like a trans version of Joy Buolamwini's and Dr. Timmy Gabru's gender shade study, if you're familiar with that. So he used Instagram photos that were tagged with these different gender identity labels, which is maybe a little ethically questionable, but then he ran them through these different like facial recognition services to see how accurate they were in classifying. And he found that they were not as successful as classifying trans women and men correctly. And in addition, they were 0% accurate in classifying, you know, non-binary genders because they just don't exist in these technologies. So, you know, I, for one, very much appreciated like the academic snark in the paper. The other study that he's known for is a bit more qualitative. He interviews a number of trans users, and it's definitely worth a skim for sure. There's a lot of different quotes in there that kind of help paint a picture of the trans experience with technology. Dr. Alex Hanna is another researcher that is very active in this space, but a bit more on the data sets and the benchmarking side. She's part of the ethical AI team at Google. For now anyway, that's the team that had, they ousted the leadership very recently, and there's a whole lot of backlash. But she writes about like whose values are embedded in training data in general. And is also just very outspoken about discriminatory systems. Here she's calling out a study that was generating faces from people's voices, which I thought was timely because I think just a few weeks ago, Spotify was in the news for like talking about doing something similar. They kind of denied it, but we'll see where that goes. We also have Dr. Sasha Costanza. They are at MIT and they're affiliated with the Algorithmic Justice League there. She's also the author of Design Justice, which is a really, really great book to read if you're interested in how to like truly design systems that are led and built to serve marginalized communities. And it's actually open access. You can read online for free by going to that site, or you can Google it as well, which I definitely recommend. It's a very good book, and taking sort of an approach to design and data systems that is inclusive, like truly inclusive, and actually benefits the people that need to be benefited. A couple of additional folks you might run into in this space. Hicks is a historian who looks at sort of the history of computing in general and how it's kind of boxed out women historically, stuff like that. But they have a paper that comes up a lot in this space called Hacking the System, because we like that pun. And it looks at how the history of transgender folks in Britain and how they fought against a very early example of state transphobic algorithmic bias. Nikki Stevens also deserves a mention here. They focus more on the data collection side, which we'll touch on in just a moment, but they have a project called Open Demographics, which is really, really cool. It's like a repo of survey design measures, or survey measures, with the reasoning behind asking things a certain way. which you kind of don't see that level of depth a lot in that space. So it's definitely work that deserves a shout out here. In addition, here's just a few orgs I wanted to introduce you to, just in case you're looking for a community or speakers in the future. Queer in AI is a community for LGBTQ plus folks in the field. They do conferences and events, things like that. Trans Tech and Trans Hack are more training and economic empowerment organizations for the community. And they're also doing really good work. Both have Black founders, and Trans Tech is actually founded by Angelica Ross, who's a famous actress. You might know her as Miss Candy from Pose, if you're into that show. But all really good organizations to know. Yeah, but that kind of wraps up that section. And I know we've covered a lot today. I'm sorry, I go through things quickly because I just have so much to share. But I appreciate you all sticking with me. And I wanted to end with a few takeaways of things that we can all do to do better in this space. And the first one I came up with was to question these systems, and specifically to think very carefully before you do any sort of automated gender recognition, or AGR. So this means anything that has like a gender prediction or a gender inference piece to it. And we saw a bunch of examples of this, right? These are things that use like your face or your body characteristics or your voice or your name or your browsing behavior, whatever, to guess your gender. And then that in turn dictates what kind of advertisements you get or customer service stuff. There's just, this type of technology is embedded in a lot of things, and we need to start rethinking that. I actually love this tweet a lot. Ooh, I just saw I gotta address that. The genderbread person, there's a lot. That was actually my favorite too. And this is behind the scenes. I do like the genderbread person better, but I got called out hard for using it. There's a lot of controversy within the community for that, because it was like stolen by trans creators. So while I think it is a little more clear, the gender unicorn is the acceptable one to use for the community, which I did not know until I published something. But anyway, sorry. But this tweet in general is really cool, because it kind of talks to like, people don't like to be misgendered. It doesn't matter if you're cisgender or transgender, like nobody likes to be misgendered. They don't like being misgendered by people or by machine. It's just not cool. And for trans folks, it can be really dangerous. So it's up to us to be really careful about that. But also this tweet is a play on words, because there's like 2 trans holidays that both start with Trans Day of. So they're making sort of a funny about that, which I have appreciated. But the big thing I want to mention in sort of this takeaway is something that's a bit controversial, because a lot of AGRs are used in like tools or studies to call out binary gender discrimination. So for example, there might be like a citation analysis that genders people by their names and then says like, oh, you only cited like 10% women in your study, like do better, get to know more women researchers in your field, which is, a noble intent, but sort of it has some issues. Using names to infer gender is biased against people who don't have Western names. It's going to misgender people. So I like purposely didn't say avoid, because I'm not going to tell you what to do, and I'm not really into absolutes in general. But I think the big thing there is that there's always trade-offs in these types of things, and it's sort of the whole field of data science. And you got to think about who you're excluding, and if it's kind of worth it to advance one group at the expense of another and stuff like that, or if there's like an alternate way that we're not even thinking of that we can co-liberate. And there's actually a fun R package called Gender Ender, which kind of pokes fun at sort of libraries that a lot of these studies use that do like name to gender inference. But Gender Ender instead lays out like all the reasons that you can't infer gender. Like the only way to truly know someone's gender is to ask them and hope that they trust you enough to be honest about it. Secondly, we have a lot of work to do to update our systems. There's a really great article by Meredith Broussard who's the author of Artificial Unintelligence, about how our databases need to be updated when it comes to gender. Like, it's no longer cool to hard code M's and F's anymore. Like, we know it's more complicated. We know there are like even legal documents now that have a third gender option. We know that gender can change over time. And like the biggest argument for me is like the technology exists now. We're no longer strapped for storage space anymore. So there's really just no excuse not to have updated systems. The second article here is about how Gen Z is like the most openly queer generation because they've had access to so much information. So it's just not a question anymore. Like, these things are going to have to change. Like, the younger generation is demanding it, and it's kind of up to us to make that happen. Lastly, in order to make meaningful progress on cissexism in automated systems, the reality is we're going to need better data. Like, right now, we can really only talk about like the blatantly transphobic technologies because we just don't have the data to uncover like the sneakily transphobic ones. Like, honestly, we don't even know how many transgender people exist in this country because we don't get counted. So we're just like so far away from being able to do anything like algorithmic auditing or the things that you see that uncover racism or binary sexism. But we can work towards that by starting to collect more inclusive gender data when it's appropriate. And this is actually a question I get a lot. Like, people will reach out to me and be like, hey, how should I ask for gender better on my survey? Because people do want to do the right thing, you know, and be more inclusive in their surveys, but it is like legitimately confusing. Like, there's a lot of resources and opinions out there. I even found an asking for gender alignment chart online, which I thought was funny. And there's not even like a good consensus within the community, which makes it a lot harder to navigate. So this is something that I've thought about a lot because I keep getting the question. And I've started working on like a flowchart type tool that would organize a lot of the resources that exist out there. And eventually it would be like an interactive thing that you could step through to help someone kind of navigate these issues and all the different things that you should be thinking about to find an appropriate measure for their like specific use case. And if we have time, which we might, look at me, I can show you like a very early draft of that. And for the record, I thought that this alignment chart was funny when I found it, but please like never do any of those on the bottom. And I will be like very absolute about that. Like, male and female in this context are very much like dog whistly type terms, and they give off a very like sex assigned at birth vibe, which to me is just very much like not neutral at all. So yeah, maybe just stick to the top row, like your choice. Yeah, so just a review of the 3 things we talked about to start doing better about cissexism and data systems. You know, questioning these systems, updating these systems, and working towards collecting more inclusive gender data when it's appropriate. And hopefully, you know, more awareness and intention about these things will help us create a more inclusive future for all genders. And with that, thank you again. You know, I'm always thrilled to be able to talk to people about this stuff. I could talk all day. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions or talk more. But thank you for having me.